Okay, welcome back to Chapter 6 of the Rathus Introductory Psych Text. In this video, we're going to finish up Chapter 6 and continue our exploration of memory. I wanted you, in the last video, to think about memory as a verb, as this process of something that we're building and sort of from the ground up. Each time we form memories, so it's an imperfect process. We looked at the information processing model, and now we're going to look at some extensions of that and also look at why we've looked at why memories are formed. We're also going to look at why we forget things. So let's check our comprehension before we go forward to make sure we're all on the same page. Shane is studying for a vocab test. When he studies the word braggart, he thinks of how his friend Bill acts whenever Bill wins a tennis match. Shane is processing this word at A shallow level, B intermediate level, C deep level, or D personal level. Go ahead and write your answer down, or think about it, write your answer down, pause the video, and come back in just a moment. Okay, welcome back. You should have put deep. I believe in the previous video we talked a little bit about deep versus shallow processing. Shallow is just kind of like, hey, if you're trying to memorize a phone number, you say it over and over and over again, or if you're trying to memorize a list, you just kind of say the list over and over again. Whereas deep would be trying to find some kind of personal connection to it, or make it, or something that just makes it easier to remember for you personally. Make it silly, make it interesting, make it like connect to something you know, like this person, Shane, connecting braggart to his friend Bill. That's a personal connection. Although, granted, D is personal level, that's not really something we talked about. It's deep versus shallow processing of information. Okay, let's move on to another truth or fiction. It may be easier for you to recall the name of your first grade teacher than the name of someone you just met at a party. Pause the video. What do you think? True or false? It is in fact true. Yeah, sometimes, we meet people, and even though we just met them, depending on the circumstances, depending on the context, maybe we meet someone at a party, and then that's not enough time to really, form that memory connection with that person. Maybe you talk to them for 30 seconds, introduce yourself, and move on. You're probably less likely to remember them, but maybe, even if you spend several minutes talking to this person, or even most of the party, well, hopefully most of the party by then you figured out their name, but let's just say it's a party where you're consuming adult beverages. I mean, maybe that influences it. You see this person the next day or a week later at another party, and you forget because, well, the last time you talked, you were in a different state of consciousness. So that's also part of it. And also, your first grade teacher is somebody that you saw, if you went to class every day, assuming you went to class most days, you probably saw your first grade teacher 100 times or more. And then, hey, when you went to second grade, you still may have saw your first grade teacher around the school even. So it's not like you had a lot of interactions with your first grade teacher. I can still remember my first grade teacher's name, Mrs. Singleton. Sorry, she was married. So anyways, yeah, see if you can remember your first grade teacher's name. Test your memory that way. Okay, let's talk about a special type of memories that psychologists have studied. They're called flashbulb memories, and they are memories. They're called flashbulb memories because they seem to leave kind of this flashbulb imprint on our memory, because they're typically very important, or they're events that just really stand out, either because they're surprising or because they're important, or just because they involve a lot of emotions. They're typically more distinct from other memories. Like it's not it's not something that happens every day. It's a lot of connections that are being formed, sort of a network of connections. And also, there's a lot of elaborative rehearsal involved because, it's so important, or just stands out so much that it has a deep kind of personal meaning to you. And this is linked to some biology. There's some biology involved, obviously, with the way the brain processes memories, but also in hormones as well. But an example, of this would be, the next slide would be 9/11. This would be, if you are old enough to recall, 9/11 was a very powerful event, a very tragic event. Obviously in 2001, I can remember I was in middle school when that happened. I believe I was in 8th grade. I was in my 8th grade earth science class that day when I heard about it. And that's one of those things that'll kind of always stick with me. If you're older or younger, other events may be sort of flashbulbs for you. if you're older, depending on how old, maybe the Challenger shuttle exploding is a flashbulb memory, or if you're even older than that, maybe Kennedy being assassinated, or some of the civil rights movement stuff, things like that. Maybe if you're younger, some of maybe the flooding of like I'm thinking of like the tsunamis and things like that have happened around the planet, or the hurricanes that have happened in the United States, things like that, like Katrina and otherwise, might be flashbulb memories for the younger generations. Or, this last presidential election, regardless of who you voted for, it was just so, just such a crazy event all around that maybe that's one of those things you're like, I'm never going to forget the 2016 election or something, just as an example. So anyways, truth or fiction, you may always recall where you were and what you were doing on the morning of September 11th, 2001, again, or insert whatever memory you want to put there. But the answer is true, because it's a flashbulb memory. It's one of those that just, you may not remember everything exactly, but you're going to remember pretty much the large, big picture details. I don't remember what I was wearing in my earth science class that day, but I do remember I was in earth science. I remember it was Mr. Jacobs' class. I don't remember who else was in the class with me or anything of those details. I just remember kind of the big picture things. Oh, my slide is kind of slowing down, so sorry about that. There it goes. Okay. Now we're going into organization of long-term memory. We talked about long-term memory. We store things there. It's mostly permanent, but doesn't mean we get it out. A lot of the reasons why we do or don't get it out is based on how we organize and store information. So long-term memory is sort of organized in a categorical fashion. We group things that are similar together, experiences, sort of like nouns, people, places, things. We organize those categories sort of hierarchically. And here's kind of what I mean by a hierarchy. So we have this category of living things, and underneath that might be animals and plants. And obviously we could break this down even further to mammals and fish, and plants would be shrubs and trees, and this breaks down even further. But here's an interesting quandary. We have mammals and fish. Where do we put whales? If you're kind of organizing these things. So you can kind of see how this gets complex very quickly. Monkeys, that could break down even further. Rats could break down. Whales and all those things could continue to break down. So into more and more structures, hierarchies. An interesting phenomena when we're trying to pull things out of memory, it's called the tip of the tongue phenomena. Again, it's when something is just there, it's on the tip of your tongue, you're trying to remember the answer to the question, you're trying at maybe a trivia game, or maybe you're, just when you're taking your test or when you're getting called on in class, you're trying to think of the answer, but it's just on the tip of your tongue. Some cues might help, but it's going to take a little more. And luckily, it's so interesting now with phones. It feels like things like this happen a lot, but we can easily solve those problems just by looking up the answer on our phone. It could reflect. It also can inflect. We just didn't learn it. We didn't memorize it completely, or we have maybe partial understanding. So sometimes things are on the tip of our tongue for a reason. Maybe we just didn't encode or store the information. A couple other phenomena: context and state dependent memory. Dependent memory is, when we store information in one particular context or setting, it makes it easier to retrieve it if we are in the same context or setting in which we learned. So, for example, if you study at home in a quiet, maybe in your room, in a quiet place where you're not being disturbed and you're sitting in maybe a particular chair, like your favorite chair, this is, if you're taking your test for this class online, you should take your test in a similar setting. Obviously sitting in the chair and the quiet room isn't going to give you any answers, but it may provide cues that may help you make it easier to retrieve that information while you're studying, or from studying to taking your test. And conversely, there's also state-dependent memory, where if we're, where it's a lot easier to retrieve information if we're in the same state of mind emotionally or physiologically as when we learn the information. So if you're relaxed and you're kind of calm and you're in your quiet room in your favorite chair, try to manifest that same feeling. That's those same feelings when you take your exam as well. So try to, match your mood, match your physiology. If you're eating some snacks or something to keep yourself, satiated while you're studying, do the same thing while you're maybe taking your test. Again, you're just trying to give yourself some cues that might help. Okay, quick comprehension check. Or maybe not. Oh, there it goes. Sorry. Marco, a college freshman, is sure that he knows the name of his old Little League coach, but he cannot quite pull the name out of his memory. Marco is experiencing A, anterograde amnesia, B, retrograde amnesia, C, associative interference, or D, tip of the tongue phenomenon. Go ahead and pause the video and jot your answer down. Okay, welcome back. It is in fact D, tip of the tongue phenomenon. Unless we know for sure that Marco got hit in the head during Little League baseball, we cannot say that it's amnesia for sure. It's tip of the tongue. Maybe he knows it's coach so and so, but he just can't remember what so and so is. It's on the tip of his tongue. It's been a while. Okay, truth or fiction? If you study with the stereo on, you would probably do better to take the test with the stereo on. Truth or fiction? Pause the video. What do you think? Okay, welcome back. It is true, although I wouldn't blare the stereo while you're studying and while you're taking your test, but just know that, hey, if you're listening to some music while you're studying, try to listen to the same music or very similar music when you're taking your test. It'll make it a little bit easier to retrieve the information. It's giving yourself cues, kind of like little pegs or something to grab hold of as you're climbing up, as you're moving up. You can have something to grab hold of as you're climbing the mountain. Okay, we're going to talk about forgetting, why we forget. A lot of the research about why we forget information comes from studying using nonsense syllables. And nonsense syllables are combinations of three-letter combinations of usually two consonants and a vowel that have they're not words, they're sayings or parts of words, or not even prefixes or things like that, but things that we don't even use. So I'm going to flip forward a couple slides to show you an example. This is what I mean. These are nonsense syllables. Wom, seg, or keg, however you want to say it. Gore, nif, czar, muck, jek, back. Those are not words. And so why those are important is those have no meaning to people, so we can find out kind of the baseline. Like, if this has no meaning to you whatsoever, how long does it take you to forget? How long does it take you to forget these meaningless sets of nonsense syllables? So when we're going to talk about that in a moment with some research by Ebbinghaus. So some of the tasks that are used to kind of forget, to see how forgetting is measured. One is recognition. Maybe you forgot. Hey, you might be given a list of words like these nonsense syllables like this, and then asked, hey, do you recognize the word wom? On another list, it will say, hey, do you recognize the syllable wom? And you would say, yeah, I recognize that. But if there was another, let's say there was another nonsense syllable that wasn't on this list, and they asked you, okay, did you see this? And you said, well, I'm not sure, or yes, I did, or no, I didn't. That would be, what they're trying to look for, see what you forget and what you don't. There's also recall. They might ask, hey, how many of these can you recall? Like, we're going to let you look at this list for like a minute, and then, take 30 seconds, and then write down as many as you can. Also, one of the other ways is relearning, how quickly it takes people to relearn stuff. You've heard the saying, once you learn how to ride a bike, you never forget. Well, that is mostly true. If you used to ride a bike as a kid and then you stop riding for a while and you pick a bike back up, there is kind of this like relearning phase where you kind of have to get your balance again. But obviously, like some things like that, it doesn't take us very long because our brain, our muscle memory kind of kicks in, and all right, we can figure this out. Some research you can read about memory and recalling our grades. Read about it, figure 6.7. I'm going to move on, though. I'll let you read about that. This is what I want to get to is Ebbinghaus. This is a researcher by the name of Ebbinghaus is really interested in forgetting. And so he used those nonsense syllables to study forgetting. And so he would provide people with a list of nonsense syllables just like this, maybe longer, maybe shorter, depending on the research questions. And what he would do was test people immediately on their recall, and then also test them over the course of maybe 2 days all the way up to a month later. And notice, within the first day, if we look at our graph here, in the first day, or in that first hour or so, people within the first, right after, if you were to look at this list and asked to recall it maybe a minute later, you probably could recall most of it, or really close to it. But within 20 minutes, look how far this drops off to 60%, meaning 40% of the information is lost within 20 minutes. Within an hour, it drops all the way down to 40%. Within 9 hours, we're down to probably about 35%. And then a month later, we've basically forgotten it all. Like maybe we might remember like one of these on this list by then. For one, it has no meaning to us. But again, really what he's showing is unless we do pay attention, unless it does have meaning, we are going to forget very quickly. It'll be out of sight and out of mind very quickly if we don't make some sort of personal connection to it or really take the time to memorize the information. Another theory about why we forget is called interference theory. Basically, information interferes, long-term information, short-term information, and that information processing model kind of interfere with each other. There's retroactive interference, where new learning interferes with the retrieval of old learning. And conversely, proactive interference is where old learning interferes with new learning, with information of new material. So this is why it's probably a good idea to avoid studying topics that are similar to each other. You don't want them to kind of interfere with each other. You know, if you're studying government and history, or let's say you were taking a course on U.S. history and taking a course on European history, I mean, there is some overlap there, and maybe you kind of mix things up a little bit. Or you're studying multiple languages, French and Spanish, Italian and Spanish, Italian and German. You know, you might want to break those things up and give yourself some space so you don't run the risk of interference. All right, truth or fiction? Learning Spanish can make it harder to remember French and vice versa. Wow, I feel like I just talked about this. What do you think, true or false? Pause the video. It's in fact true. Another reason why we forget, according to Freud, is repression. Sometimes memories are so painful, so much anxiety, so much tension and stress that we forget them almost on purpose via repression, according to Freud. But really not a whole lot of support for, like much of what Freud purported, not a lot of scientific support for this. Okay, yeah, I kind of glossed over this false memory thing. I'm going to show you a video on false memories. There's a lot of research by Elizabeth Loftus about false memories, how they can be implanted. So we'll talk about that later, but for now, we're going to move on. Children also we have to be suspect. Children of memories before the age of 3, because the brain is literally still developing before then, especially the hippocampus. So really there's just like, you know, I mean, not to say that people can't have memories before the age of 3, but it's also just, they're probably memories of what other people have told them is kind of, I'm not saying they're not, you know, not to say I'm not trying to say you don't have memories, but a lot of the things that we think are memories sometimes are what other people have told us. So, you know, or they're definitely influenced by the things that other people have told us. So especially memories of when we're very young, very, very, very young. So there's that as another phenomena related to memory. And here's some explanations about why, you know, for one, at the time, infants, especially before around the age of 1 or younger, really have no interest in remembering the past. It's not something of concern at that moment. It's really not all that meaningful at that time. And then also, since not having the use of language does limit the ability of how people think. Language and thinking go hand in hand. Language is a reflection of our ability to think. That's not to say that babies don't think because they don't use language. It just means it is in development. So you can tell their ability to think and their ability to speak and use language is in the development. And also their sensory ability to code, sensory input, ability to see, to hear, things like that is also limited at this time. I mean, infants don't come out of the womb fully ready to go. I mean, they are still developing once they're born. We also have anterograde and retrograde amnesia. Anterograde is this is usually memory lapse right after a physical trauma. So you're having a tough time maybe remembering some things, like forming new memories. Whereas retrograde is maybe you have a tough time remembering things right before or even further back from the trauma. So sometimes people can have a little bit of both depending on the severity of the trauma, the physical trauma to the brain. This usually occurs with like concussions or blows to the head. Most people don't just develop amnesia I mean, it can happen through, psychoactive drug use, but again, we're talking typically about trauma to the brain. I mean, it's usually a reaction to trauma in the brain. And if you've ever seen the movie 50 First Dates, it's not quite that sensational, but it is still very serious. I mean, obviously, something to look, it's usually one of the symptoms of a concussion is this sense of amnesia. Let's see. So when we are forming new memories, we are talking about this process of long-term potentiation where basically we're forming and connecting neurons. When we're talking about memory formation, we're talking about neurons literally connecting to one another. And this is what this looks like. We look at initially, we have a single connection here, but as through the process of memory formation, we can see a second connection has been formed. So this is memory formation is physically changing the brain. It's altering the physical layout of the brain, forming new neural connections. So if we're trying to get to the smallest unit of why memory occurs, it's these neural connections that are being formed. Okay, so one last topic I want to talk, a couple more really short topics I want to talk about about memory. One of those is eyewitness testimony, and again, I'm going to show you a video about this as well, but I just really want to put a bow on this and say that we should be really skeptical, not that people are trying to lie or be deceitful, but we should be skeptical about eyewitness testimony because memory, as we already know, is subject to change. It is suspect at best. It's not a perfect, or it's a flawed system. And a lot of research has shown that there's just not as much accuracy. We put a lot of stock into things like eyewitness testimony and polygraph tests when they really are not as accurate as we think. For example, there's a lot of research that shows that eyewitness testimony it's not as accurate as we think in terms of identifying people of different racial or ethnic groups, like somebody who is white and is trying to identify somebody from another racial or ethnic group. A lot of research shows there is much to be desired in terms of accuracy. There's a lot of research that shows that people can be misled easily by the wording and things like that. So, we have to be very, very careful about how we use eyewitness testimony. It's not to say that it can't be used, but it should be used in conjunction with other forms of evidence, like, DNA evidence and maybe, physical evidence of other sorts, like, camera footage or pictures or things like that. Last thing I want to talk about is where memory is stored in the brain. Kind of already discussed this earlier, or I think I did, but the hippocampus is primarily where we see memory of especially with declarative memory, autobiographical and memory of facts and things like that. That's stored in the hippocampus. But it also, the cortex is involved, the sensory cortex, the cerebral cortex is involved as well. The limbic system is all involved, at least with declarative memories. The prefrontal cortex is a big part of this. This is the part of the brain that makes us who we are as people. We can think about concepts like past, present, and future. Obviously, are very important to memory. There's also the thalamus, which is involved, the relay station involved with verbal memories. So there's a lot of the brain involved when we talk about memories. I mean, the hippocampus is kind of where it starts, but again, we're talking about the cortex, the thalamus, the limbic system is all involved as well. And then if we talk about muscle memory, the memory of how to do things, that's a whole nother network of systems too. We're talking about the cerebellum on the back of the head. The prefrontal cortex is involved in that as well. Our somatosensory cortex is involved. Our motor cortex is involved. So memory is an incredibly complex system. And again, I can't say this enough. It's a flawed system as well. So I've already talked about this comp check question, but what mechanisms of the brain play a role in memory formation and retrieval? Go ahead and pause the video and write a few answers down and come back when you're done. Okay, welcome back. Should have talked about the hippocampus, the thalamus, the cerebral cortex, the somatosensory cortex, the motor cortex, the cerebellum, all of those things. Almost the entire brain is involved in this process, but you can get really specific if you'd like. So with that in mind, that's going to wrap up chapter number 6 on memory. We're going to stop here. When we come back, we're going to look at cognition and 3 really interesting subtopics within the umbrella of cognition. So we'll come back and jump into that with Chapter 7. So I'll see you all in the next video.